The series of blasts rattled some Russian officials, raising alarm about whether Ukraine has become emboldened to inflict damage inside Russia proper as Putin's war nears its one-year mark. It's also raising questions about whether Russia is capable of thwarting Ukrainian strikes at all. The prospect that Ukraine may be willing to expand its arsenal of attacks inside Russian territory in the coming days could mark a new arc in the war, with Ukraine taking more brazen actions against Russia and Russia on its back foot. Ukrainian forces continue to work to strike Russian military logistics in Luhansk, according to the Institute for the Study of War. Ukrainian aviation on Wednesday carried out 17 strikes against the Russians, as well as 4 strikes against Russian anti-aircraft missile complexes, according to a brief from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And while Russia began launching assaults against civilian infrastructure in October, cutting off civilians from water and heat, after several attacks and explosions in Crimea, Russia has still not resorted to nuclear weapons. There are other signs that Russia may not be willing or capable of dramatic escalation. Russia's military posture has become so degraded throughout the war in Ukraine that its ability to respond forcibly or in an escalatory way is diminishing by the day, said Truesdale. As of last month, Russia only maintained enough missiles in its arsenal to conduct 3 to 5 more waves of missile strikes against Ukraine, according to Vadim Skibitsky, a representative of the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Russia said Wednesday the toll climbed in its worst single reported loss from a Ukrainian strike, which under criticism Moscow blamed on troops using mobile phones. The Ukrainian military's Strategic Communications Unit has said nearly 400 Russian soldiers were killed in the town of Makiyivka in eastern Ukraine, and even Russian commentators have said the death toll may be far higher than the 89 Russia has reported. As Moscow grappled with the aftermath of the strike, France's President Emmanuel Macron told Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky that his country would send French-made light tanks to help repel the Russian invasion. The death toll in Makiyivka is the highest reported by the Russian military in a single strike since its troops invaded Ukraine in February 2022. The deadly strike came after months of discontent towards the military, since the Kremlin suffered a series of battlefield defeats and launched a hugely unpopular mobilization drive. Russia's defense ministry initially said on Monday that 63 soldiers had been killed, in an extremely rare admission. On Wednesday, the ministry said the toll had climbed to 89 after more bodies were found under the rubble of the temporary base where the troops were housed. It announced a commission was working to clarify what happened and vowed that guilty officials would be punished. In a video, Lieutenant General Sergei Sevryakov said the tragedy had likely taken place because Russian troops had used cell phones, giving away their location to Ukrainian forces. Thousands of people have been killed in Ukraine and millions forced to flee their homes since President Vladimir Putin ordered troops to attack on February 24. Following a wave of Russian strikes on Ukrainian targets on New Year's Eve, Moscow said Ukraine struck Makiyivka at 12:01 a.m. local time on January 1, using US-supplied HIMARS rocket systems. The French presidency said Macron wanted to increase aid to Ukraine by accepting to deliver AMX-10 RC light tanks. Zelensky on Twitter said he thanked Macron for the decision to transfer light tanks to Ukraine. In Russia, calls mounted to draw conclusions after the Makiyivka tragedy. There have been reports that the servicemen were quartered in an unprotected building which was destroyed because munitions were stored on the premises and detonated in the strike. Dmitry Azarov, the governor of the Samara region, was due to visit the wounded that had been brought to the southern city of Rostov near the Ukraine border. The Russian-installed head of the occupied part of the southern region of Zaporizhia, Yevgeny Balitsky, said 5 people were killed and another 15 wounded in the town of Vasilyevka. On the Ukrainian side, the General Staff reported Russian shelling in Kramatorsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. The presidency said 5 people had been killed and 13 wounded by Russian fire in the past 24 hours. Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine in February 2022 was a turning point for Europe and the world in many respects. An authoritarian leader in Moscow ordered a full-scale invasion of Russian troops into Ukraine, which became a direct threat to all of Europe. Democracies looked fragile. China's rise seemed less and less peaceful. However, despite frequent statements about the decline of the West and the destruction of the liberal world order, the 10 months since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war have shown the opposite. The circumstances that made the United States of America a determining factor in world affairs a century ago still remain. Putin cannot achieve his goals in Ukraine because of its breathtaking national resilience and its comprehensive support from the collective West. This, in turn, gives reason to hope that in the near future another autocrat, Xi Jinping of China, will not dare to directly and militarily challenge the liberal order. However, if certain lessons from this war remain unheeded, U.S. conflict with China may become more likely. In the ongoing competition between the great powers, another conclusion is obvious. Despite acts of aggression against its neighbors and a significant nuclear arsenal, Russia is in no way an equal competitor to the United States or China. The US is a superpower, and Russia is not. Putin's overly ambitious goals in Ukraine indicate that he has not understood this important point. Putin's invasion of a neighboring state was not driven by a desire to maximize Russia's security. Moscow has never had the same level of security on its western borders as it has in the 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. The Russian dictator knew very well that NATO was not a threat to him and that no Western state was going to attack Russia. Putin invaded Ukraine not for reasons of security, economics, or any material gain, but to overcome the humiliation of lost greatness, to satisfy his own sense of his place in Russian history, to maintain control over the states of Eastern Europe, and perhaps to defend a certain set of beliefs, the paranoia of an autocracy trying to maintain power in an era of liberalism. Ukraine's fate has proven important enough to the collective West to justify spending billions of dollars on arms supplies to Ukraine, to endure rising gas prices, and expand security commitments in Europe, including the entry of Finland and Sweden into NATO, the granting Ukraine, along with Moldova, of candidacy for EU membership, and making Western states actual allies of Ukraine in this genocidal war. This is because the defense of Ukraine is the defense of the liberal world order. It will be in danger if Ukraine falls. The United States and its allies are using their power and influence to prevent this from happening. This is an obvious lesson for Ukraine as well. The motto, "Never alone again," should be the guarantee of security in the future. You cannot be without friends and allies. Integration into the EU and NATO should become an imperative. Full post-war integration with the Western community is fundamental for the future of Ukraine and necessary for European peace and security. Ukraine must seize Europe's biggest nuclear power plant back from Russia by force as efforts to establish a security zone around it evaporate, Kiev's top nuclear official said. Petro Kotin, the president of Ukraine's nuclear utility Energodom, cast doubt on calls by the International Atomic Energy Agency for Ukrainian and Russian authorities to impose a security perimeter around the Zaporizhzhia plant in southern Ukraine. The 6 reactors, captured by Russian forces in the first week of the February 24 invasion, have been subject to artillery and missile attacks, raising the risk of a nuclear emergency. The nuclear risk raised by the Kremlin's occupation should also be kept in mind by countries still doing billions of dollars worth of nuclear business with Russia, said Kotin, adding that Ukraine has several years' worth of fuel inventory for its reactors. Russia's state-owned nuclear giant Rosatom has continued playing an outsized role in international nuclear markets. Its subsidiaries still supply more than a fifth of the enriched uranium used in the US, and millions of Europeans still need its nuclear fuel to generate electricity. Rosatom continues work on projects from Bangladesh to Egypt and Turkey. Rosatom claimed full ownership over Zaporizhzhia in October, forcing workers to reapply with Russia's state-owned company to keep their jobs. The chairman of its supervisory board, Sergei Kiriyenko, who's also the Kremlin's first deputy chief of staff, visited the plant late last month in a move condemned by Kiev's government. The Ukrainian government's effort to persuade other nations to cut ties with Russia's atomic industry won the backing of Holtec International Corporation, the closely held U.S. nuclear supplier working with Kiev's government. The death of dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of Russian servicemen in a Ukrainian airstrike on a military base in the occupied city of Makiivka has been met with widespread rage, directed at political leadership in the Kremlin and military leaders, as well as Ukrainian forces and their Western allies, who supplied the weaponry used in the devastating attack. The attack on Makiivka, a suburb of Donetsk, was carried out by using rockets fired by the sophisticated HIMARS system. Advanced military equipment supplied by the United States and European allies has frustrated a Russian military mired in the thinking and equipment of the 1990s, if not the 1980s. For older Russians, the attack can only serve as a reminder of the Soviet war in Afghanistan, where US-equipped mujahideen fought off a young and inexperienced invasion force. The first war in Chechnya, waged in the mid-1990s, saw similar humiliations for ill-prepared and unmotivated Russian troops, leading some mothers to march to the battlefield in hopes of stopping the conflict and rescuing their sons. And pro-Kremlin propagandists have cast the invasion as an ideological, even existential, battle against the West, in which Ukraine is supposedly but a pawn, and Russia, improbably, is the underdog. The cost of war has often fallen on young men from the hinterlands, many of whom have never been to the power centers of St. Petersburg or Moscow, and who don't necessarily share the Kremlin's geopolitical goals, especially if they come from ethnic groups that had themselves been subjugated by Russia or the Soviet Union. Last fall's mobilization roiled Russia, and young men fled to avoid conscription. Ukraine has continued to gain ground, and peace talks seem distant, meaning that the war will likely continue well into 2023, and perhaps beyond. Ukraine's ambassador to Israel condemned a call this week between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Israel's newest top diplomat Eli Cohen, who was appointed as foreign minister late last month, suggesting there has been a change in policy between Moscow and Jerusalem. Russian President Vladimir Putin greets Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu during their meeting on January 30, 2020, in Moscow. Top supporters for aid to Ukraine like Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican South Carolina, pushed back on Cohen's comments and said, "The idea that Israel should speak less about Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine is a bit unnerving." Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has not reportedly spoken with his new Israeli counterpart, though Netanyahu has spoken with both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Netanyahu from the campaign trail suggested under his leadership Israel might begin providing arms to Kyiv, but Zelensky seemed unconvinced following a recent call with the six-term prime minister. According to a report by Axios last week, Netanyahu called Zelensky ahead of a United Nations General Assembly vote on a resolution that called on the International Court of Justice to provide a legal opinion on the ramifications of Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands as defined by pre-1967 boundaries agreed to under the UN. Netanyahu allegedly asked Zelensky to either vote against the resolution, which was approved by 87 nations while 24 countries voted against and 53 nations abstained, or to abstain from voting altogether. Zelensky apparently did not like the non-committal answer and instructed Ukraine's diplomat to the UN not to attend the vote, a move that sidestepped Netanyahu's wishes. The Israeli leader was reportedly disappointed by the decision. Tehran denies supplying drones to Russia, though the U.S. Department of Defense said Russia has bought hundreds of them. Russia fired 84 drones at Ukraine in the first 2 days of 2023, all of which were shot down by Ukrainian air defenses. The U.S. announced it would supply a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine in late December, bringing the Biden administration's total military aid for Ukraine close to $22 billion. President Joe Biden recently signed a $1.7 trillion government funding bill that includes $47 billion of additional aid for Ukraine. Budanov said he expects fighting to be the hottest in March, adding that Ukraine is planning a major push in the spring. Putin's regime is a laughingstock for everyone, Budanov said, adding the Russian troops are all but reduced to defending territories they still occupy within Ukraine and not for much longer. Moments after the interview ended, Budanov warned our team that rockets had been fired at Kyiv from the Black Sea. Hours later, Russia unleashed another massive aerial attack against Ukraine, ringing in 2023 with terror. According to Ukraine's Center for National Resistance, this will mean the large-scale forcible conscription of Ukrainian civilians to fight against the Ukrainian armed forces, an act internationally recognized as a war crime. The CNR calls on residents of the temporarily occupied territories to ignore Russia's passportization campaign and immediately leave the occupied territories so as not to become a resource for the enemy. A devastating Ukrainian HIMARS strike on a Russian base in Makiyivka, Donetsk Oblast, on December 31 generated significant criticism of Russia's military leadership inside Russia. The strike, which Ukraine alleges killed at least 400 Russian soldiers and wounded an additional 300, was so large-scale because the location struck is said to have been an ammo dump playing dual role as a barracks, an oversight so massive it's prompted Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to start an investigation into the matter. Russian troops started shooting civilians after receiving news of Ukrainian strikes at their warehouses and barracks. Key participants of pro-Russian protests in Germany are bound by shared far-right views or ties to Russia. In a new investigation, Reuters journalists identified some of the most prominent individuals who advocated for peace with Russia and for an end to German support for Ukraine. In just one example, a participant in a pro-Russian rally in Cologne in September 2022 was Max Schlund, formerly Rostislav Tesliuk, a former officer of the Russian Air Force. He changed his name after moving to Germany 10 years ago. A series of explosions rocked Novy Oskol in Russia's Belgorod Oblast. The cabinet of ministers have continued export bans on a number of Ukrainian commodities. These commodities include natural gas of Ukrainian origin, liquid fuel, fuel oil, edible salt, and gold and silver in unprocessed or semi-processed forms, as well as in powdered forms. Quotas for the export of anthracite, coal and briquettes derived from it, pellets and similar types of solid fuels, as well as waste and scrap of precious metals, are also set at zero. The average price of a hectare of Ukrainian farmland is around $1,435. That sum is derived from around 41,979 in the land market in Ukraine, covering in total 77,668 hectares of farmland, according to the Ministry of Agrarian Policy. This is 38% more than in November and 47% more than in the same period of the previous year. The price of 1 hectare of land in Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast, which tops the land price rating, is UAH 292,700, or $8,004. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has already caused $700 billion in damage. PM Denis Shmyhal stated that Kyiv, together with the World Bank, plans to conduct another thorough verification of exactly how much funding Ukraine would need to recover after the war. These massive damages are prompting the US to pressure Switzerland to channel Russian funds frozen there into compensation. Swiss publication Nüssdeutsche Zeitung says that these frozen assets total almost $8 billion, and include 15 pieces of real estate. According to the Swiss Bankers Association, Russian assets kept in Switzerland are estimated at $200 billion, but most of the funds belong to individuals who are not subject to international sanctions. Germany is also open to the idea of using frozen Russian funds as compensation for Ukraine, but hasn't taken an official position on the matter just yet. In particular, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock wants Russia to pay for the damages caused in Ukraine. The former co-leader of Germany's Greens, who is a longtime advocate of a tougher stance on the Kremlin, insists that seizing at least some of the frozen assets needs to be an option. At the same time, Finance Minister Christian Lindner, who heads the pro-business Free Democrats, is more cautious. French President Emmanuel Macron told his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky that France will provide armored combat vehicles to Ukrainian troops, and President Joe Biden confirmed the US may send its Bradley fighting vehicles. Kirilo Budanov, the intelligence chief, also told ABC News that he expects fighting to flare up in March as Ukraine pushes on with an offensive. Russia said 89 soldiers died in a Ukrainian rocket attack on New Year's Day, raising the estimate for the number killed from 63 in what is the deadliest acknowledged Russian death toll of the war. Putin planned to hold talks Wednesday with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has sought to play an intermediary role in the conflict. Russian forces focused on a push toward Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine and were attempting to improve their positions near Kupiansk, Avdiivka and Lyman, Ukraine's general staff said on Facebook. Ukrainian troops repelled Russian attacks near 10 settlements mainly in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, it added. In the past 24 hours, Russian forces launched 7 missile strikes, 18 air attacks and targeted civilian infrastructure in Donetsk and the southern Zaporizhia and Kherson regions with multiple launch rocket systems, according to the statement. Biden said he's considering sending Ukraine the US's Bradley fighting vehicles to aid the country's defense against Russia's invasion. Macron told Zelensky that France will provide Ukraine with French-made AMX-10 RC armored vehicles used by the French army, according to an Élysée official. The official declined to specify the number of vehicles or the timing of the deliveries. Although the official described the weapons as tanks, they run on wheels, not tracks, and are heavily armed but lighter than tanks. Macron confirmed what he called the offer of light combat tanks in a tweet. The Polish government approved the purchase of 116 M1A1 Abrams battle tanks with supporting vehicles for $1.4 billion, Defense Minister Mariusz Błaszczak said in Warsaw. The initial supplies of older generation tanks are expected this year, with all tanks to be delivered by the end of 2024. The U.S. will cover some $200 million of the purchase cost from grants earmarked for Poland. Fighting is likely to be hottest in March as Ukraine plans a spring offensive into territory including the eastern Donbas region, controlled by Moscow before the February 24 invasion, and Crimea, which was seized by Russia in 2014, the intelligence chief said. Strikes will take place deeper and deeper inside Russia, he said, without specifying who would be behind the attacks. The European Union is backing a $15.5 million project to aid Ukraine's war-torn farming sector, implemented by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. Ukraine expects US-supplied Patriot air defense systems to be deployed in the country, in the absolute short term, to help fend off Russian attacks, Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said during a video briefing. Preparations for the transfer of the systems have already begun, Kuleba said, without elaborating. The Patriot, which stands for Phased Array Tracking Radar for Intercept on Target, is manufactured by Raytheon Technologies Corporation. Each system costs around $400 million, not including the Lockheed Martin Corporation made missiles, according to the size. Germany authorized deliveries of military equipment to Ukraine worth about €2.2 billion, $2.3 billion, last year, more than a quarter of the government's total approvals for arms exports of €8.4 billion. Russia said 89 soldiers died in a Ukrainian rocket attack on New Year's Day, raising the estimate for the number killed from 63 in what is the deadliest acknowledged Russian death toll of the war.